Let's look at every single state that got wrecked by weather in 2021 and actually compare that to how states have been wrecked by weather in 2022. Now, 2022 hasn't been going for as long. However, there weren't that many states that got really wrecked by weather in 2021 that weren't already wrecked by something else before. And by wrecked, I don't just mean like a storm affects the state. Significant damage has to occur in the state. And I will be strict about this. You'll see just how strict I can become about the inclusion. But in 2021, I think the first storm that even qualifies as wrecking an area would be the cold wave winter storm. What I really at this point is called the Great Texas Freeze of 2021. And the Great Texas Freeze was a great freeze. It did not live down to its name. Rather, the name couldn't live up to just how destructive this event was. And I'm saying event because a cold wave isn't really a storm per se. Setting all-time record lows from North Dakota to Texas, setting records from Montana all the way down to Texas. This storm was destructive even in areas where all-time records weren't broken. At the very least, some kinds of records were broken. One of these records was the costliest weather event in Texas. Possibly even the costliest weather event in the United States, so that depends on how you think of inflation. The storm did cause nearly $200 billion worth in damage. And over 200 and at least almost 250 people lost their lives. This was because of the power crisis that went on during the state. It begun as the event moved through around February 10th. I think it peaked around February 15th to 16th, but it didn't fully go away until after everything had abated by the 27th of February. They were only 277 seconds away from an all-out power failure. Texas was wrecked by this freeze. We can already add one state to our list of states wrecked by weather in 2021. However, a lot of these next events couldn't really wreck a state. As destructive as they might have been, wrecking a state just implies something else. It implies some catastrophic impacts. Some specific towns were wrecked, like Ohatotchi in an EF3 tornado on March 25th of 2021, but it couldn't wreck the state. That's a bit different. Alabama as a whole was not wrecked by this tornado outbreak, although they were by some other tornado outbreaks. So, with nothing really happening in March or April or May, we look to June. And I would still not argue that Alabama was wrecked by Claudette, because despite the loss of life of 14 people, the damage was not all that severe, and a lot of them were really in traffic collisions, making it hard to argue Claudette wrecked the state. However, Oregon and Washington would be wrecked by a heat wave. Between the two, 228 lives were lost in the 2021 Western North American heat wave. We call it Western North America because British Columbia is not always thought of as in the Pacific Northwest, which was really the most wrecked by this heat wave, as they saw over 600 deaths. Europe also saw, Yukon, Northwest Territory, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Montana, Idaho also set records during this heat wave. I don't know what I was saying before. And so in total, at least nearly 1,000 lives were lost during this heat wave. It caused It caused about $9 billion in damage in just the U.S. alone. So I would personally argue that Oregon and Washington were wrecked by this heat wave. So we can add 2 more states. And these states are very rarely wrecked by weather. It's rare. So 2021 was very unusual. Of course, we would see a lot of countries be wrecked by weather, like in the floods in Europe or Henan, which was in China. Those floods would certainly wreck those countries, but I do want to focus on the U.S. for now, to the dismay of many of my viewers. July didn't really see anything all that unusual because the heat wave was mostly structured in June, but August and September did from the same event, Hurricane Ida. Louisiana saw 32 deaths and $55 billion in damage, and the entirety of New Orleans was without power. So you could make a pretty easy argument for Louisiana was wrecked. But by the time it became an extratropical environment, by New Jersey and New York, the power outages had gone down quite a bit. So how are these states still wrecked by weather? Well, apparently 3 inches of rain in an hour is too much for New York City to handle. And with the ground already saturated from storms like Henri, Ida simply caused the even streets to be flooded, and basement apartments in Queens to be flooded, as well as in other places. 18 deaths were in New York, which saw between $7.5 and $9 billion in damage. New Jersey saw between $8 and $10 billion in damage, with 30 lives lost. As such, both states were wrecked by this event. Hoboken, New Jersey, also saw significant damage. And New York City's flash floodplain did not even really improve after Ida, which was very unfortunate. However, September was mostly calm after this, as was October and even November. Very few, places got really wrecked by weather at this point. December, however, changed that. With tropical cyclones wrecking the Philippines, especially Bohol, and Malaysia also being wrecked by floods, the U.S. was not really spared. With both the Western Kentucky and Bowling Green tornadoes occurring in Kentucky, Kentucky was wrecked by weather. About 75 lost lives occurred in Kentucky due to the tornadoes, along with billions in damage, but we don't know what the true cost was in Kentucky. However, most other states were mostly spared by this event. So while, again, some individual towns might have been wrecked by weather, as a whole, you can't argue that they were wrecked the same way that Kentucky was. Now, while the Midwest derecho did certainly spawn destructive impacts, no state was truly wrecked by this weather event, and as such, that is also excluded from the list. 2022, of course, internationally, a lot of places got wrecked, including Pakistan by floods. I'd argue some of the more international heat waves, but they didn't really cause that many impacts. Except Europe. Europe was definitely wrecked by heat waves across multiple countries, most notably the United Kingdom, which saw 1,700 deaths, though some European countries saw higher death tolls. And the 1680 deaths was just 1 week across the UK. It's very likely the death toll was much higher. So, again, after seeing this, what happened in 2021, 2022 did start off more sparing. Internationally, I talked about those events. Most of them were during the summertime, however. So, nowhere really got wrecked by weather in in the earlier stages of everything. That being said, however, some places will get wrecked by weather later on in the month. I know I'm being repetitive, and that's why nobody watches my videos, but oh well. So while some places were wrecked by weather earlier on, like in March, they weren't really. It was really just, again, towns like Winterset in Iowa. Hard to argue that the entire state was wrecked by weather when it really wasn't. It was just one area. This theme also continued into the later tornadoes of April and May. Nothing really standoutish about the weather. And even into June, this pattern persisted. Nowhere was really, it was nothing really outstanding in any particular area, and weather frequently failed to make the news. But in July, that all changed. With nationwide floods from July to August, the most infamous is the flooding in eastern Kentucky. Kentucky yet again was wrecked by weather, with 40 people dying in the floods. However, the property damage for this is actually combined with St. Louis, annoyingly. With only 2 deaths, however, St. Louis was not really wrecked by weather. And even if it was certainly not like a Missouri statewide thing, unlike what happened in Kentucky. Kentucky, again, though, wrecked by weather, with some comparisons drawn to the Mayfield tornado, but this affected eastern Kentucky, not western Kentucky primarily. Although I'm sure western Kentucky had its impacts. Oh, and I forgot for 2021, the Tennessee floods, it did cost 20 deaths and $101 million in damage, but again, I'd argue that for middle Tennessee, they were certainly wrecked by this, especially Waverly. Hard to argue, though, a true statewide impact. And the same does apply, of course, for the March 27th floods in Nashville. But August, however, it remained relatively quiet. And the heat waves this year were much more spread out across the country. So even though it totaled to 117 deaths and $9.3 billion damage, we didn't even know where that occurred, and I could put more research into it on when and where it occurred. Now, September, we would see Puerto Rico practically wrecked by Fiona, with about 25 deaths and billions in damage, and the entire island losing power for a while. Not as bad as Maria, but certainly destructive, and I would argue that they got wrecked by it. Although Puerto Rico isn't a state, it's just a territory. Another state that got wrecked by weather is Florida with Hurricane Ian. $67 billion in damage, 131 deaths. Cuba also arguably got wrecked with the entire island losing power. But with 5 deaths and $200 million, I'm kind of split on Cuba. But Puerto Rico, definitely. But Florida was definitely wrecked by this. But that's kind of about it. I would argue that as of right now, 2021 did have those more lingering impact in 2022. That being said, I do want to look at the last time each state got really wrecked by weather.